Good morning, folks. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We are meeting again this week. Today is March 2nd. It is 9 a.m. and we have our regular business agenda before us. We will start by recognizing our existence with a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue, Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner Hackett, Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 5 out of 7 commissioners present.
Very good. Okay. We will start with commissioner comments. Do folks have comments? I think we're all kind of commented out. Go ahead, Commissioner McGowan.
I'm real tired.
If you've not been with us, we've been fairly busy on a financial assurance rulemaking that found its way to conclusion yesterday. Okay, with that, we will move to public comment. We only had one person sign up for public comment. That was Kate Christensen. So if she is with us, we will find her and bring her to the panel. And I do note for the record that Commissioner Bogue is with us. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Congratulations on being done with the rulemaking. I bet. Wow. Congratulations. It's weird being the only one here for public comment. I don't see my giant timer, but I will just go ahead and start.
Hey.
Try not to go over 3 minutes.
I'm not going to time you.
Okay.
Talk to us.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
don't like take advantage of it, but just talk to us.
Promise I won't. That's really nice of you. That thing like takes up the whole screen. So I just wanted, you guys have been super busy with the rulemaking, and I assume that this report hasn't crossed your awareness yet, but I just wanted to let everyone know about the UN IPCC report that came out yesterday, or maybe everyone's read it. I don't know, but the main takeaways of that report on climate change are that we have a very, very small window to do anything that will make a difference. And the other piece that I thought was really important was the social justice piece of that report. They really talk about how vulnerable people across the world, like I want to zoom out. We're not just going to talk about Colorado, which has a huge, disproportionately impacted communities, and we talk about that a lot, but globally, millions of people in Africa and Asia have already been displaced because of climate change. And I wanted to kind of remind everybody that as you're approving all these Ogdps, that you have so much more power than I do. Like I can, I just biked with my kids to school. I can eat a plant-based diet. I can have solar panels. I can have energy efficient vehicles, but none of that is gonna make as much of a difference to our global climate as one well that gets approved, because that is gonna have a decades-long impact as far as the emissions from the extraction on our own states, emissions and ozone, which we're into, severe ozone non-attainment, but it's going to have decades of impact on our global greenhouse gases and climate change. And when I've had individual conversations with commissioners, a lot of times I hear but China's burning so much coal, so what can we do? What does it matter? But it does matter. It really does. The power you have and the decisions you make matter. You have the ability to really make a positive or negative impact on what our immediate future will be. So with the emissions that are burned, one of the things that our state does not do is take into account exported emissions, and we export the vast majority of our oil and methane. So if we took into account the emissions burned that are extracted in our state, it would be over the entire emissions created in our state, including transportation, including building, including all those emissions. So I know that the commission has said, like, if you dot your I's and cross your T's, you're going to get approved for these permits. And I realize that that is generally the case, but I think zooming out and thinking about the bigger picture of what every single one of these wells means to the global impact might be beneficial. So that's all. And I can email everyone the IPCC report if you haven't seen it yet. So thanks for taking the time to hear my comments. I appreciate it. I feel like we're all friends now. I feel like I got to know y'all so well during the rulemaking. So thanks for the time.
Thank you for being with us. Does anybody have questions? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I saw the report. I've read the executive summary at this point. Appreciate you bringing it to our attention.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm impressed. You guys have been busy. I'm impressed that you were had time for that. So thank you. Bye,
Okay,
everyone.
take care.
You too.
Okay, with that, we have two docketed matters before us. Before we roll into those docketed matters, we also have several enforcement matters that we may have questions about. Can we bring Ms. Mercer to the panel and open it up for any questions on our enforcement docket? Great, there she is. Good morning.
Good morning, commissioners.
Anyone with questions want to start out, if at all? Commissioner McGowan and then Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today, Ms. Mercer. I'm wondering, sorry, AG Mercer. I'm wondering if you, and you might not know this, but for the Alamosa enforcement action, it seems to me like maybe there's some red flags there, and I was wondering if you or staff could tell me if they're up to date on their financial assurance.
Yes, thank you for the question, Commissioner McGowan. So we, staff did check to make sure that Alamosa is up to date on financial assurance as recently as yesterday, and they are adequately bonded. They have a $60,000 blanket bond, which is the correct amount under the current rules for their wells.
Thank you.
And that would be the current financial assurance, is not the new structure that becomes effective April 30th. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, just to clear the air, we've been talking financial assurances quite a bit here recently.
Right.
Okay, Commissioner McGowan, did you have any follow-up? Okay, Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, AAG Mercer, for being here. I also had a question related to Alamosa, and I definitely am not trying to second guess what's in the order, but I just wanted to better understand, because inability to pay was raised as an issue. First of all, I'm really happy to see that there is kind of like a first deposit payment, so to speak, that will be paid, relatively quickly. For some of the suspended amounts and some of the amounts that are suspended in lieu of plugging actions, for example, were all of those costs taken into account with respect to inability to pay?
They were. So thank you for the question. We took, both staff and in our discussions with Alamosa, we were really looking at this from a holistic perspective to try to determine, based on the documentation they submitted for ability to pay and Alamosa's commitments to what they believe they can achieve. We were considering it all together, basically. So part of the reason for the relatively low cash payment is because Alamosa committed to spending a significant amount of money plugging the Martinez 1A well, also making sure that they're retaining on-site a contractor down there and various other financial commitments. So it was all looked at holistically.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I always appreciate seeing, plugging in lieu of payment, just because that's such an important thing for operators to do. So thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions? Okay, it looks like we're good. Thank you again, Ms. AAG Mercer, for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Okay, we now will take up docket number 2107-00111. It is a Mallard exploration OGDP. And I believe we're looking for Ms. Jost and Ms. Weslinki. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good
We do
morning.
not have public comment associated with this OGDP, so I believe that we will, let's see, we also have Mr. Moret from Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Ms. Larson, how were we planning on doing this? I know we had a presentation from the applicant, and then I know there were questions, CPW. Did we have a preferred order route here?
Yes, in conversations with Mr. Moret, Mr. Moret will be presenting first, and then have the opportunity for commissioners to ask any questions with respect to his presentation. Then we would move on to the applicants.
And applicant attorneys, y'all good with that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, very good. And good morning, Mr. Moret. Thank you for being with us today. If you could identify yourself for the record and also sort of generally sort of explain why you're here. I know, but everybody else doesn't. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, commissioners and the public. My name is Brandon Moret. I am Colorado Parks and Wildlife's Northeast Region Energy Liaison. And I'm here today to talk about the general consultation process that CPW has undertaken over the last year for Senate Bill 181. And so my presentation is going to be focused on our general consultation process, but not project specific. And I believe Ms. Larson has my presentation that she can advance for me, or someone there.
Give us just a sec.
Perfect.
Okay, I think we can see the slides.
Thank you. Then we'll go to the next slide, please. So where are we heading with my presentation? So I want to, further introduce myself and the other energy liaisons and our land use specialists and what is reviewed in a CPW consultation. Then I'll get into how does CPW determine whether to waive the formal ALA requirements. Again, these are only for high priority habitats. Then I want to discuss operators have choices regarding site selection and mitigation options. Then I'm going to get into how is direct compensatory mitigation, whether it's dollars or acres, how are those calculated for 11+ acre disturbances. Then I'll get into compensatory mitigation for indirect impacts. And then if an operator does choose the mitigation option, whether it's dollars or acres, how and when are those paid or the projects due? And then I have some time available for questions from you commissioners, or if you have questions about a particular slide I'm on, feel free to chime in. But the goal, obviously you've been in the midst of financial assurances, but the goal for this 10-slide presentation is for you to have a general understanding of our consultation process to date. So next slide, please. So again, I'm in the Northeast region of Colorado. I am Brandon Moret, as I mentioned. And in the Southeast region is Dr. Karen Voltura. In the Southwest is Brian McGee. And in the Northwest region, we have Taylor Elm, who is the regional energy liaison, and also land use specialist, who is Miss Danny Newman. And so we're all trained wildlife biologists with various specialties and experiences that have helped us with these consultations. And while the 5 of us have had multiple conversations about how to apply these rules, I'd be remiss if I didn't also take the time to thank your OGLAs, because to ensure that all of us are correctly interpreting these rules. Next slide, please. So what is reviewed in a CPW consultation? It's important for CPW to schedule a site visit with the operator for most, if not all, OGDPs, Form 2As, or comprehensive area plans located in a high priority habitat. So what we'll do is we'll discuss with the operator regarding their proposed plans, ALAs, BMPs, and any direct or indirect mitigation and how they are calculated, and their eventual wildlife mitigation plan that they'll forward to COGCC. We'll also focus our discussions on actions to avoid, minimize, and mitigate their impacts. And also we'll work with local CPW DWMs, biologists, and species-specific subject matter experts to determine the quality of the habitat and the amount of wildlife use. And as we've seen so far, there are no two sites that are alike in the consultation process or outcomes. And I should mention that most, if not all, of CPW's consultation to date have been pre-application discussions, which we really appreciate, since it helps inform the wildlife portions of the proposed Ogdp, Form 2A, or CAPs that are located in the map HPH. And also I wanted to note for you commissioners that the vast majority of these consultations to date have occurred within the proposed locations in mapped high priority habitats versus the other consultation triggers under Rule 309. Next slide, please. So how does CPW determine whether or not to waive the AOA requirements? Again, I'm only talking about high priority habitats. So we look at site-specific conditions. Are there existing oil and gas or other infrastructure on the landscape? Are there opportunities to co-locate facilities? Are there reasonable alternative locations outside the high priority habitat where the operator has development rights or access near their development area? And that's the area, obviously, where the operators will access their minerals. And what impacts are expected? And I do want to credit operators because it seems like for the most part, they have been completing these AOAs before consulting with CPW. Obviously, they have a lot of factors to balance when siting a location, and only one of them is wildlife. So we do ask them to articulate their various AOAs from a wildlife lens to help ensure that they satisfy our concerns. So I put a hypothetical example in that figure there. This is located near I-25 and State Highway 7, even though it's technically an abandoned location for this hypothetical scenario. If this were to hit my desk and it's just outside the quarter-mile bald eagle nest and SO buffer, that's the orange, but still within the half-mile bald eagle buffer, that would be one that I would discuss with the operator. Hey, can you move to the northeast? Or hey, can you move to the south so you're outside the half-mile buffer? Next slide, please. So if you only remember one thing about my presentation, it's this, that operators have choices regarding their site selection and mitigation, because the 1200 series rules are flexible as intended to allow for operators to have that operational flexibility that they need while protecting sensitive habitats. So if a new Ogdp is located in a 1202D high priority habitat, and again, the 1202D are those big game winter ranges or grouse production areas, then the operator has two options for offsetting their direct high priority habitat impact. Per 1203A1, they can complete or cause to complete a project that is approved by CPW and the director, or the second option is to pay a habitat mitigation fee to CPW to calculate, that is calculated to reimburse all the necessary and reasonable costs incurred by CPW. And I put that little caret symbol there that the habitat mitigation fee for disturbances less than 11 acres is $13,750, and that's per table 1203-1 in the rules. And also, we'll work with the operator to evaluate the potential for indirect impacts, and I'll discuss that in a few slides. But the evaluated mitigation is based on the operator's proposed plan. For example, if an operator chooses not to avoid a sensitive season for one reason or another, that may require higher amounts of mitigation, again, dollars or acres. Next slide, please. So how is direct compensatory mitigation, dollars or acres, how are those calculated for 11 plus acres of disturbances? CPW looks at everything. We evaluate the proposed operation, the size of the permanent and temporary disturbances, associated land costs, and other site specifics with the operator, and that can be combined with other mitigation options. Generally speaking, this is a table that I've sent out to operators in the Northeast region when calculating if their pads and roads are more than 11 acres. And this base cost that's in the base costs column, those are numbers on how we originally arrived at the $13,750 dollars. And so, especially if operators are on the borderline, if it's going to be 11.1 or 10.9 acres, this helps them understand that once you reach that 11 acres, it jumps from 13,000 and it could be upwards of 30,000, just depending on that. So next slide, please. To help you understand this table better, I used a hypothetical example that both of these scenarios have 12 acres total of disturbance acreages. That's the gray highlighted box. In the top table, you can see that 6 acres is permanent disturbances, whereas in the bottom table, 6 acres is the temporary disturbances. So even though both of them have the total acreage of 12 acres, you can see that the one that has more permanent disturbances would cost the operator more versus the one in the lower table, less permanent disturbances. Even though there's more temporary, it would still cost the operator less. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, Karen discussed this during your September meeting, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but CPW evaluates a variety of factors when it comes to indirect impacts. And we look at them on a site-by-site basis for 2 different types of indirect mitigation options that the operators can choose from. Next slide, please. So if an operator chooses the mitigation option, and again, the rules allow either dollars or acres. And so if we're just focusing on the dollars with this slide, how and when are those direct fees paid? So it states it in Rule 1203C that the operator chooses to pay it, they must submit their payment no less than 30 days prior to submitting their Form 42, which is their notice of instruction. So what's the process? The process is after their Ogdp has been approved by you, the commission, the operator should coordinate with their appropriate regional energy liaison to receive and fill out the compensatory mitigation fee paperwork. Then the next step is the operator will submit that paperwork and write a check to CPW. Then that transfers the burden from the operator to us at CPW to find, select, and implement projects to offset that impact to that specific HPH on the behalf of the operator. Next slide, please. So now if we focused just on the acres, okay, an operator wants to do a mitigation project themselves or have it be completed on their behalf. So how and when are those mitigation projects due? So those requirements are outlined in Rule 1203B, the compensatory mitigation plan. CPW will work to provide feedback to the operator on the mitigation project to offset the anticipated impacts from the proposed project. Ultimately, the director will consult with CPW on the adequacy of the proposed compensatory mitigation plan. And the timing of the project initiation and completion will be dictated on a project-specific basis. Next slide, please. So, try to keep this short and sweet as for a general overview for you, especially since you've been in the middle of financial assurances, but I wanted to thank you for your time and attention and leave some time if there's any questions for you as commissioners, and also note that I have the other energy liaisons on standby if you have anything specific to them or their regions.
Thank you, Mr. Moret. We do appreciate you being with us and providing the PowerPoints and the presentation with regard to this issue. Fellow commissioners, are there questions? Commissioner Messner, then Commissioner Najapa, then Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Moret, for providing an overview of the review process. And so I've got questions just generally about your presentation. I'll also have questions about application that's coming up, but I'll focus these initial questions just on the presentation that you gave. So my first question is, understanding that you're undertaking a review process and a consultation associated with operations that are being considered in high priority habitats. And no doubt, I'm sure that those consultations are in depth. A lot of it's on the ground. some of it's through pre-application conferences. I think my question is how are you capturing those consultations and those communications and sharing that with the commission as we are attempting to review these applications and making a determination of of whether or not they meet our rules?
Absolutely. Yeah, great question. Thank you for the question, Commissioner Messner. A lot of that is going to be captured in the wildlife mitigation plan, and you'll see later from Mallard as far as their site-specific one. But generally speaking, yeah, we do try to articulate both to the operator in their wildlife mitigation plan as far as our concerns and how they're alleviating our concerns. But at the same time, we're also open to, since this is a new process, if there is a certain way that you would like to see the results of that consultation, whether it's meeting notes from the field visit or whatnot, we're happy to accommodate such.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Moret. I think as I acknowledge that this is a new process, at least in a previous life as a county commissioner and as a planning commissioner working with CPW on land use reviews on a regular basis, typically I see those consultations captured in an independent document provided by CPW. Because when I look at applications, it's a little bit hard for me to discern whether this is a proposed wildlife mitigation plans independently by the operator, or whether these are suggestions that are being provided by CPW or conditions of approval. And
absolutely.
So it's certainly helpful for me to be able to understand, where it's coming from. And certainly there's some overlap, because I'm sure that the operator's wildlife mitigation plan is going to, should incorporate the suggestions and conditions of approvals that's provided by CPW, but it's not always clear where those wildlife mitigation measures originate. So it's just a thought there.
Also, if I may, Commissioner Messner, we also include our comments in the Form 2A too. So the operator will include their BMPs, and while we have the option of whether to agree or to modify those BMPs, and then the operator will agree or modify our BMPs, so that there's that dialogue there as well.
Okay, I appreciate that. So my second question is regarding alternative location analysis and how CPW determines whether or not to waive that requirement. My understanding of the discussions we had during the mission change rulemaking is that certainly we gave CPW the ability to waive that, but not necessarily to waive it for technical feasibility reasons or for operations reasons, but rather potential impacts to wildlife. And, it's understandable that there's going to be some circumstances in the state of Colorado where an operator could be in a situation where high priority habitat is multiple miles surrounding a particular site. And so I acknowledge those situations, but it seemed like in your slide around how CPW is evaluating whether or not to waive an ALA, there was some technical or operation considerations in there. And so I didn't know what your thoughts were on that, and whether there needed to be any clarification on, how those two things work. In my opinion, the waiving of an alternative location analysis would be a rare instance.
Thanks for the question, Commissioner Messner. And you alluded to the situation that I have been confronted with in the Northeast region, as far as, especially with pronghorn winter concentration area. It can be many miles outside an operator's development area for them to, where it's nearly impossible for them to access those minerals from outside the high priority habitat. And so while that may be a one component, I would say that the discussing and having that conversation, especially with the local field folks that know this area very well, as far as understanding, okay, even though this entire area may be pronghorn winter concentration area, is there an area maybe with more disturbance where pronghorn are already likely to avoid, or lower quality habitats that would be better to site this location? So even though both locations may be in the high priority habitat, that would be an angle that we would take as well.
Okay, I appreciate that. And then just a final question, because now that we've got, you know, a few applications that have been reviewed, and I think I brought up this concern during the mission change rulemaking, and but I think anytime we put a prescriptive number on compensatory mitigation requirements, whether that's acres disturbed or not, that creates room for an operator to, I think, shift operations a little bit in order to have to pay less or more versus a performance base, which is there is impact. Let's tie the impact to the appropriate dollar amount. Are you seeing any challenges as you're reviewing applications with that kind of prescriptive threshold, and whether or not the adequate amount of compensatory mitigation is being considered in situations?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Messner. Yeah, that's something that we have kept in the back of our mind, but especially with the year-end review that was presented earlier this year, we just don't have the number of locations that have come in yet. And also for CPW, we haven't received any mitigation dollars yet to date. And so once we start getting those mitigation dollars in and on the landscape, especially if operators choose to pay CPW to offset their impact, then yes, when I discuss with field staff, hey, you know, I need you to put, you know, $13,000 on the ground, and they're like, it's impossible, or it's doable. It obviously depends on where in the landscape. If you're closer to the Front Range or further away, you know, there's a lot of variables that go into that. But once we get more data, yes, I think that would be an appropriate conversation to have at some point in the future. But at this time, I would say we just don't have that type of information available.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Moret, I appreciate you answering my questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. I can't remember who was next. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you so much, Mr. Moret, for being here today and helping us kind of understand what you went through here. One comment I'll just make was similar to what Commissioner Messner said about the waiver. It did seem a little odd to me that it was sort of an email communication where there was language that was suggested by the operator, and then kind of just yeah, we recommend that, you know, COGCC waive. And so I would also suggest that I think that needs to be a little bit, you know, more tightened up and clear that there is like a waiver, you know, document stating as such. The other thing I would just note is that I think the language, you know, that was used, it was CPW recommends that COGCC waive the ALA or something like that. And really, I believe what we're trying to confirm is that CPW is waiving the ALA due to the conditions. And so again, just for future, you know, just try to, I think it would be useful to tighten that up when providing that kind of documentation. But otherwise, you know, really appreciate all the work that you did and all the BMPs, et cetera, discussed. And I was, you know, looking especially for the linear barriers and you know, what was being done to address those. And I think those have been adequately addressed. The other question that I had, which was a little bit confusing to me, is that winter concentration area is a density dependent area. And as when I map this in COGIS, there is another producing pad within a square mile that's another Mallard location. How did that factor into the mitigation and the considerations, et cetera? I mean, wouldn't this then be more than 1 per square mile density?
Yes, and that's site specific, and I'm not sure if we want to hold that question for the actual Mallard conversation following, but yes, whether it's that Mallard location or another one, if it does meet the rule of greater than 1, then yes, it would qualify for indirect mitigation. Is that your question, Commissioner Nanjapa?
So, okay, so it's not that we would not want to see locations that increase the density to more than 1 per square mile. It's that if it does increase the density, there would be required compensatory mitigation. Do I understand that correctly?
Correct. If I'm understanding your question correctly.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking of more that an ALA, might need to move a location so that you would not exceed a density of 1 per square mile. But have I misunderstood what the intent is there?
And I think I'm going to hand it off to Ms. Trask, if that's okay, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Sure, and that's she and I had a little bit of a conversation before about this, but I think this particular point we didn't really get into, and I appreciate that. But before bringing her in on that point, there's one other question I had, and that was related to compensatory mitigation, and that was I was just curious, like, when do the payments occur? So there's I think there's the issue of additional mitigation that's required if the operations extend into the winter timeframe. And so I'm just curious, does something get paid up front, and then are you sort of monitoring to see if there are operations, or I guess COGCC inspectors might be monitoring to see if operations are kind of continuing into the winter season, and then how do you then get that additional amount if that has occurred? How does that work?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Nanjapa. Yeah. So if obviously we take the operator's operational plan into their into the wildlife mitigation plan, and that helps determine the price. And as far as when that's owed 30 days prior to their notice of construction. But as far as if an operator, if I understand your question correctly, that proposes to work outside of a sensitive season, then goes into that, how is that double checked? And so, yeah, it would be COGC inspectors, probably more than CPW local field staff.
Forgot I muted myself. And so I was just curious though. So if an inspection results in a determination that there were operations occurring within that winter season that they are supposed to be avoiding, then does that trigger an additional sort of billing of the compensatory, the additional amounts of compensatory mitigation?
I would assume so, but I would punt that question to Ms. Trask or someone else at CHC, because that's probably more of a CHC enforcement action or similar, if I'm understanding correctly.
Okay, and I understand too, these are sort of newer considerations, so maybe we're all sort of learning. I did ask that of Ms. Trask when she and I met previously, and she wasn't entirely sure. So it's not entirely material to this particular application. I was just curious how that works though, when we have a scenario that is dependent on something occurring where more dollars would be required for mitigation, how we then confirm, whether or not that is needed and how that gets paid. So I guess that, is something that perhaps we could address further offline, but I am just curious kind of how that gets addressed, because we're, obviously putting forward these dollar amounts, but I don't fully understand, I guess, how that gets, I don't want to say enforced, but, but checked and paid, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so yeah, I think the other outstanding question is just related to the density dependent. I suppose in my understanding of that when we were developing those rules was that we would not allow a location greater than 1 mile density, but that would be great if Ms. Trask could let me know, maybe because of the ALA waiver that no longer matters. Is that correct?
Ms. Trask?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, I need to apologize, particularly the Mallard Harlequin South director recommendation. And we haven't quite gotten to that portion of the hearing this morning, but I did want to address that we did see that we have an error in the Mallard Harlequin director recommendation. On page 5, under the wildlife resource considerations section, we wrote that the Harlequin South pad is not located within a density area, but it actually is. So that is my mistake. I didn't catch that when we drafted this document, and I apologize for that. I take full responsibility for this error. So and I think we get into this more during the actual Mallard Ogdp discussion, but just to clarify, this location is in one of the density high priority habitats. Commissioner Nanjapa, to try to answer your question about if an operator does conduct operations within that sort of more sensitive season, there should be either a BMP or a COA on the Form 2A that our field inspection unit, when our field inspectors go out to inspect the location, they will have that list of BMPs or COAs with them, or have access to that list of BMPs and COAs. If they identify that operations are taking place when they are not supposed to be taking place, that would definitely be routed through our internal enforcement channels. If the Ogdp was approved with some flexibility, such that the operator hasn't committed entirely to abstaining from operations outside those sensitive seasons, then that should have been worked out between the operator and CPW. And I believe that we do see, or we will see, some Ogdps with sort of this flexibility built in, that if the operator does not conduct operations in the sensitive times, the mitigation fee is a certain amount. And if they do move their operations into that sensitive time period, then the mitigation fee will be a different amount. Because we haven't gone through this process yet, we're still working out how that process might best work. And try to build some efficiencies between COGCC staff and CPW staff. I think that's the best answer I can give you for now, but I'm certainly open to recommendations or suggestions if you or any of the other commissioners or operators have any ideas how we might best improve that process.
Thank you so much, Ms. Trask. And that, please don't apologize. I know there's a lot of things that we're all juggling and looking at these different things. And I think, I guess just to confirm, so the ALA waiver that CPW has provided then would not, so if the density dependent issue was part of the concern, then that would waive that as well. Is that correct?
So my understanding, and Brandon, please correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that we're kind of looking at two separate issues here. The waiving of the ALA is not related to payment of mitigation fees or assessment of mitigation fees. The waiving of the ALA is simply for CPW to determine if an ALA is required to be attached to the Form 2A.
And that's specifically because it occurs in the winter habitat. But what I'm asking is the density component. Does that also, or am I just, I think I'm just not, I thought that we were saying we would not allow locations that exceed 1 per square mile density. So I'm wondering if that it's the ALA, you're in winter pronghorn habitat, but you also have greater than 1 per square mile density. Are we waiving both? I'm just trying to understand, how this is intended to work. And I fully understand that this is all new and we're all just trying to figure it out as we go along. So I'm not trying to be critical in any way. I'm just trying to understand, what this is, how these should be viewed going forward, since this is our first one with this issue.
Yeah, I think that the 1202D rule was not intended to limit operations or locations to 1 per square mile. There can be more than 1 per square mile. I think the 1202D consideration of waiving the ALA would take into consideration if there are more than 1, how many are there? What is the total disturbed acreage of those multiple locations within that single square mile? And to give the applicant sort of options about potential other locations that might have fewer impacts within a square mile.
And Mr. Chair, if I may. And Commissioner Nanjapa, that's a great question. And yeah, as Ms. Trask mentioned, those are 2 separate issues. The greater than 1 is supposed just to be a trigger, not a top level. There's no way this is going to allow. And if you remember from during the hearings, Mr. Duranlo had a great presentation with a green buffer on 8 different sections of land. One that had 1 well, another had 2 wells, and all the way up to 5. And then there was the buffer around each well, and you can sort of see that the indirect buffer from the road and the location would cause that habitat to be effectively functionally lost for big game species. And so, and also, Mimi or whoever, can you move ahead in my slides? I actually put that towards the last slide. So if you wouldn't mind going all the way down, please, to slide 14, that one right there, Commissioner Nanjapa. So it's, if you have, you know, the, and thanks to Mr. Duranlo for putting this together. So, you know, in box number 2, you know, you have 1 well per section. And so, but with the research that we presented during the rulemaking as far as 400-meter indirect buffer, and this example is for Peons Basin mule deer that we're applying statewide. So you can see the white area in number 2, that mule deer, or in this case pronghorn, can still use the majority of the section. And even, you know, when you get to box number 4, you know, mule deer or pronghorn can still move around that hypothetical section of land. But by the time you get to box 8, you can see that that buffer distance makes that section of land effectively lost for mule deer use or pronghorn use. And that's not to say they absolutely won't use it. It's just, it's more like a descending curve as far as how likely are they to use it. So, so when it comes to these ALA discussions, Commissioner Nanjapa, we do look at this and we do want to maintain movement for big game species, whether it's the Eastern Plains or West Slope, across the landscape. But we also realize that there are locations, especially in the DJ Basin, that currently exceed 5 wells per section. So if there are future locations that are, say, 10 wells per section, that habitat would be effectively lost for mule deer or pronghorn and would not be triggered for indirect payments. Does that answer your question, Commissioner Nanjapa?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate the additional explanation and just kind of better understanding, you know, what you're looking at and what considerations go into that for the density related issues. I did understand that there was the option for the mitigation payments, you know, when you were exceeding 1 per square mile, but I thought we were also trying to avoid, you know, locations being placed at greater than 1 per square mile if we could. So that's what I was trying to understand. Okay, I think those are all my questions, and I really appreciate you being here to help answer, and thank you, Ms. Trask, as well.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Moret, for being here today. This is really helpful, and to the other commissioners who asked some of the questions that I have. So I feel like this discussion we just had with Commissioner Nanjapa is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, though. If there wasn't some sort of implied, we're trying to avoid smushing all these wells into one place, but then once you have all the wells smushed into one place, we allow you to put more because then it's less impactful. This seems like a never-ending circle. So I guess at what point would the CPW say that, this is getting to be too much and it's in the tipping point, and now we need to do something different than we normally would do. And part of this is hindsight is 2020. And when you make the rules and you think it was one thing and now you're better understanding. I'm not sure this rule that we put in place is actually very helpful, because it still allows you to grow in density, which affects the habitat. And then once you plop over into very dense, then we're like, oh, it's too dense. We'd rather that you just keep going here in this area. So it just feels like it kind of is a slippery slope. And maybe I'm misunderstanding after this discussion, but that's kind of my thought about that. If you have a response, great. Otherwise, I'll just leave it at this is kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I do. And I appreciate the question, Commissioner McGowan. And I think it gets back to that one slide that I talked about, that operators have choices. And so obviously there's a lot going on in the landscape, especially when they are determining their alternative locations. Obviously, there's been discussions on, how far away from existing housing developments, and obviously there's other oil and gas wells on the landscape. So there's a lot of factors that they have to consider. And so as far as for wildlife, especially with this image that I put up, it would be better for wildlife if oil and gas were to go to an area that's currently dense, but still have available minerals, then go out in the middle of nowhere where there isn't the unfragmented land, and that's that pronghorn or mule deer or whatever species are currently using. So, and I think the rules allow for that mitigation fee to be applied when there is still that movement on the landscape where it's not dense, but there is some infrastructure on there. And so I definitely hear what you're saying, Commissioner McGowan, as far as, we want to always make sure that these rules are protecting wildlife. And as I mentioned to Commissioner Mesner, at this point, we just have to wait and see how these rules are working. And, maybe we circle up a year from now. And as far as, whether it is, are the fees enough, or is the density too much? But we're always looking at new literature and doing research as we speak, as far as to ensure that we're protecting wildlife to the extent possible.
Thank you. The other question I had was around seasonality, and Ms. Trask and I talked about this a little bit, and I assume that when you're in a sensitive habitat and there's winter concentration, or we're having babies season, whatever, right? That the first conversation with the operator is how to avoid some sort of activity during that time. That's where the conversation starts with the operator, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. I would prefer most of our conversation to be focused on avoid. We don't jump automatically to mitigation. We focus heavily on avoidance measures and then minimization. And then whether it's their operations or whatnot, they're like, hey, we can't do this, then that's when we talk about mitigation. But yeah, we do talk about avoiding sensitive seasons or distances to begin with.
So could you clarify for me when we might be more willing to negotiate versus, I'm sorry, this habitat or this species is so sensitive that you cannot drill during this period of time? That's kind of unclear to me, that this is high priority habitat, but maybe not a high enough sensitive species, so that this instead is a best management practice, or we would prefer, or you can mitigate with a fee, or instead of you can't. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Great question, Commissioner McGowan. So in the rules under 1202C, those are the unmitigatable habitats. And so those are like when I showed the bald eagle nest example earlier in my slides, that orange quarter-mile buffer, that is absolutely no way, no surface occupancy in that right there. You can't create a new bald eagle nest over in another location just because they're unmitigatable. And so there are those 1202C species that have no surface occupancy. And then the next tier down, if you will, those are the 1202D. And so those are the big game winter ranges and the grouse and prairie chicken production areas that we try to have those seasonal restrictions. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. It was just something I was struggling with, like, high priority habitat, and it seems like it's really important. But we look at other factors as well that play into it, and that was important for me to remember. So I appreciate you clarifying that.
Absolutely.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really appreciate you being here and answering these questions, Mr. Moret. I just maybe a little more of a comment than a question, but in consideration of well density associated with high priority habitat and determining the ability to first avoid, then minimize and mitigate, to me, that's why those alternative location analysis are so important, because it's not, even if it's all in high priority habitat range, there still may be places within that high priority habitat range that could be considered that may either push an operator to a higher density area if necessary, or into an area with less density if more appropriate. And again, that's why I think that the waiving those alternative location analysis, even if they were perhaps done in-house, but for this commission to be able to look at those alternative location analysis is really important for me. And so I would be, I think I would just be very scarce in the utilization of that option.
Understood. Thank you, Commissioner Messner.
Any final questions? Great questions, great dialogue. All right, Mr. Moret, if you could stick around, we may have site-specific questions for the next matter that we're going to take up, but we do appreciate the general perspective brought to the table by the presentation. All right, I think we're now taking up 2107001111 Mallard Exploration LLC, the Harlequin Oil and Gas Development Plan. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Robbins, and thank you, commissioners. I'm going to share my screen. If you could just give me 1 minute. Great. Can you all see that PowerPoint?
We can. It's not in slideshow, so we can see some of the others, but that's fine if that's your
Okay.
preference.
I'm going to switch it into slideshow here in just a moment. So thank you, commissioners. My name is Kelsey Wazelinki. I'm with Jost Energy Law, and with Jamie Jost, we represent Mallard Exploration in the Harlequin South Oil and Gas Development Plan. I just want to start by again thanking Brandon Moret for your participation today and throughout the course of this OGDP. We do have a number of Mallard representatives with us who will be presenting the Harlequin South OGDP to you and available for questions. Before we start, though, I just want to give you a brief introduction of the Harlequin South OGDP. So this contains 2 established drilling and spacing units, and it's developing a total of 5,760 acres. There is only one new Form 2A before you today, and that's for the Harlequin South pad for the development of 8 new horizontal wells. In addition, the Harlequin South OGDP contains an existing Harlequin North pad, from which 2 horizontal wells are currently producing and 6 horizontal wells are permitted, and 1 approved Muscovy pad, which is for 16 horizontal wells, which are just currently permitted. So in total, the Harlequin South OGDP is for 3 multi-well pads to develop a total of 32 horizontal wells. And as we just discussed, because Mallard is proposing a new location within 1 mile of an existing location, this is what triggers Rule 1202D, which applies for an OGDP that causes the density to exceed 1 per square mile. And this is why Mallard has an approved CPW wildlife mitigation plan and has agreed to compensatory mitigation, which Mallard will describe in more detail to you. So Matt Volkmar, who's the president of Mallard, and Aaron Matthews, who's the VP of development for Mallard, will present this OGDP to you today. And following Mallard's presentation, we're happy to take any additional questions from you all. And with that, I will hand it over to Matt.
All right, good morning, Thank you, Kelsey. We'll jump to a quick overview of the presentation on the next slide, please. So we'll give you a brief overview of Mallard, who we are, discuss the upcoming Harlequin South Ogdp timeline. We will review the location and the high priority habitat, as much discussion will likely end up there. We'll give you a summary of our operations, overview cumulative impacts and what we call beneficial impacts. We'll review the director's recommendation for approval and jump back into a summary and take up any questions at that point in time. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Mallard. We were founded in 2017 by 5 original partners, and we've grown to 23 employees. Most of us have been working the DJ Basin since the early 2000s and have quite a bit of experience in various roles and with different operators. Our assets and operations are located in rural Northeast Weld County, as you can kind of see on the map. Currently, we've got 49 producing horizontal wells. They've all been drilled since 2018. And we have a rig in the air right now with a 21 well program in progress. We're a little bit unique just because of the age of our company and how we were organically grown from the ground up. Really haven't acquired and held on to any historic stripper wells. So it's a relatively new asset base across the board. I'll turn it over to Aaron Matthews, our VP of Development, to kind of overview the first half of the presentation, and then I'll jump back in when we touch on the drilling side.
Thanks, Matt. Again, I'm Aaron Matthews, and I'm the VP of Development here at Mallard. A brief timeline of this Ogdp application. The local land use permit was approved in December of 2019. On July 6, 2021, we submitted this Ogdp application to the Commission. The application was deemed complete in November of 2021. The 30-day public comment period closed on December 16th, with no comments being received, and the petition deadline ended January 5th, 2022, with no petitions filed. On February 22nd, we did file an addendum to this application clarifying the pads that produce the DSU. And then that brings us to today's hearing, which we would like to note was originally scheduled and noticed for February 4th. Getting into the specifics, the Harlequin South pad is located in the northeast quarter of the southeast quarter of Section 33, Township 8 North, Range 61 West, in unincorporated Weld County. Generally, the pad is east of Highway 392 and south of Highway 14, approximately 6.5 miles from the community of Briggsdale, Colorado. On this map, you can see the yellow circle represents a 1 mile buffer. The Harlequin South pad is over 1 mile from any municipal boundary, residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, designated outside activity area, school, childcare center, or DI community. The Harlequin South pad was originally and previously approved location that expired in June of 2021. That original permit was approved for 8 wells, but it had 16 oil tanks, 8 water tanks, used 2 large volume tanks for freshwater storage, had a disturbed area during construction of 12.5 acres, and was planned to be reclaimed as 7.4 acres during interim reclamation. As part of this Ogdp application, we worked to redesign this location to decrease impacts. So this application now proposes 8 wells, but 5 oil tanks, 5 water tanks, a commitment to use small diameter freshwater storage tanks, a disturbed area during construction of 7.9 acres, and a location after interim reclamation of 4.7 acres. So this redesign of the grading and the facility, we were able to reduce pad disturbance associated with construction by 4.6 acres, reduce long-term pad size and interim reclamation by 2.7 acres, and remove 14 tanks from the production facility. To further reduce impacts, Highway 14 will be utilized for the haul route to and from this pad. This greatly reduces dust and any wear and tear on county roads that are used by residents in this area. This location also utilizes 2.2 miles of existing access road that is currently being used for oil and gas operations already. And it only requires 2,500 feet of new access road construction, which you can see in red on that graphic. And additionally, Mallard has a surface use agreement in place, and the surface owner owns minerals that will be developed by this project and is a proponent of this OGDP. As Kelsey previously discussed in her opening statement, just hitting on the DSU development. So the Harlequin South Pad is one location that will develop 2 approved DSUs through 8 proposed wells. The approved DSUs are also developed by an existing location known as the Harlequin North Pad, which currently has 2 producing wells and 6 additional approved APDs that aren't drilled yet. And then there's the approved but not yet drilled Muscovy Pad to the south, which has 16 approved APDs. So the 3 pads will develop the 3,200 acre and the 2,560 acre DSUs through a combination of 32 wells going to the east and the west. We know that there was a question on the timing of operations of all of these pads, and Matt will address this in more detail near the end of the presentation. And as Kelsey had mentioned, as a reminder, today's OGDP is just considering one new Form 2A for the Harlequin South location, which has 8 wells associated with it. So the Harlequin South location only triggered one alternative location analysis criteria. The location and the access road are located entirely within the 1202D high priority habitat for the pronghorn winter concentration area. On this graphic provided, you can see the Harlequin South pad in relation to the mapped pronghorn winter concentration area shown in the peach color. So as was hit on during Brandon's presentation, this is the location that is located deep inside the habitat. So prior to submitting our application, we did consult with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and due to the inability to move this location outside of the HPH area and therefore avoid the habitat, CPW did waive the ALA requirement for this location. Being that we were in the high priority habitat and through our consultation with CPW beginning in April of 2021, we prepared and submitted a site-specific wildlife mitigation plan for CPW's review and approval. Per the plan, Mallard has agreed to compensatory mitigation efforts to mitigate direct and unavoidable adverse impacts to the habitat. The mitigation fee for the direct impact is $13,750, and that was calculated based on what you saw in Brandon's presentation, being that the pad size is under 11 acres. And then the mitigation fee for the indirect impacts is a sliding scale, with the final amount being calculated and finalized by CPW based on the timeline of development. If all the development occurs outside of the pronghorn winter season, mitigation fees would be between $19,000 to $39,000. If development had to occur during the pronghorn winter season, mitigation fees would be increased to $150,000 to $155,000. In this scenario, we've elected for all mitigation to be completed by CPW on behalf of Mallard. And in response to some of the questions we received, we want to note that it is Mallard's intent to drill this location outside of the pronghorn winter season. However, we have worked with CPW to develop BMPs for this location that are protective of the habitat, regardless of the timeline of development. I'll present more detail on these BMPs next. So as mentioned, we developed a site-specific wildlife mitigation plan that was provided to CPW for review, feedback, and approval. This plan outlined various BMPs that will be implemented at this location to best protect the pronghorn habitat. Some of the BMPs included limiting use of fencing or other linear barriers, but when needed for safety, using wildlife-friendly fencing designs. Use of pipeline for oil, produced water, and gas takeaway to limit vehicle-wildlife interactions, and use of CPW recommended pronghorn seed mix for all stabilizing of stockpiles, cut and fill slopes, and during interim and final reclamation. Next slide, Kelsey. And here's just a snippet from the director's recommendation, but per the director's recommendation, this location was deemed sufficiently to mitigate potential impacts to wildlife resources or wildlife habitat. And now I'm going to kind of switch over to our proposed development timelines and then an overview of our typical operations and procedures here at Mallard. So here you can see we anticipate starting development at the Harlequin South pad in May of 2023. This would be after the pronghorn winter season has ended. We would then move into continuous operations of drilling, completion, and flowback, which would result in the wells being online prior to the start of the 2024 winter pronghorn season. We do want to note, though, that the proposed timeline is dependent on many external factors such as rig and frac crew availability, equipment supply chain, as well as third-party pipeline connects. And the first step of operations is pad construction. At this location specifically, the existing topography has a gradual slope to the southwest, which will require moderate cut and fills. But to control stormwater, controls consisting of cut swells and earthen berms will be constructed around the location to direct and control stormwater to the temporary sediment traps. To ensure protection of the surface and groundwater, we plate our locations with 6 inches of aggregate road-based material, which we compact to 4 inches. This deters spills from easily seeping into the soil. It also minimizes dust and wind erosion. To further minimize dust, we have water via truck watering always available for the pad or access road as needed. And all of the stockpiles and cut fill slopes, as mentioned, will be stabilized using the pronghorn seed mix and mulch upon completion of construction. And now I'll turn the presentation back to Matt for more information on our operations.
Thanks, Aaron. The next few slides cover some of the mitigation measures and technologies that are in place throughout the operation side of the pad. So starting on the drilling side, a lot of these mitigation measures are getting pretty consistent among operators, but we'll kind of touch on everything and answer any questions that come up afterwards. But we do have synthetic liners that are utilized under all the rig equipment to ensure there's no chance of spills. Surface holes and casing is set by a more efficient surface rig, which overall limits our time on location. This is done with fresh water, mud. Air monitors are installed before the big rig arrives. Each location is a little bit different with their location, but there's essentially an air plan behind the scenes that monitors for VOCs over different durations and has different activation measures depending on what kind of, if any, VOCs are recognized. The rigs have dual fuel capabilities. They're closed loop systems on the mud and cutting sides. We're using Group 2 oil-based muds rather than diesel. Cuttings aren't stockpiled or stored. They're continuously hauled off location, and rig lighting is focused towards the operations and away from the exterior area of the rig and the pad. Next slide, please. On the completion side, a lot of these mitigation measures carry through. The synthetic liners are kept in place and expanded to essentially be under any piece of equipment or pipeline that is managing fresh water. On the frac side, our completion crews are Tier 4 quiet fleets. Our proppant is moved via sandbox technology. This basically eliminates any chance of silica dust. Again, lighting is focused towards the operations and away from the exterior of the pad. Our completion design and simul-frac results in basically an 84% pumping efficiency. This is from third-party sources. Essentially, what this means is every minute, hour of the day, we're pumping 84% of the time with little downtime. So it overall just minimizes our overall time on pad. The basin average, I believe, is around 70%. All of our fresh water is moved via pipeline, and no trucks have ever been used. We have a closed loop flowback system with ECD redundancy, and all of our flowback water is sent directly into pipeline. And then all of our facilities are constructed during the drilling or completion phase, so they are ready to go. And essentially within 24 hours of first gas, all of our wells are taken off the flowback and sent into facilities. Next slide, please. Moving on to the next step, production and infrastructure. Again, containment is installed around all tank separators and all equipment. Tank vapors and any fugitive gas is all captured and either sent back into the gas sales line or combusted via ECDs. Something that a lot of operators are moving to are pneumatic controllers for all valves on locations. Essentially, have just compressed air instead of natural gas that controls all of this. We will have electricity that's brought to location and runs all of our equipment. We have analyzed electricity from the drilling side and drilling rig utilization, but there's just not enough power in the grid in this rural area to basically supply the power requirements for a drilling rig. As you can see in the picture, all the flow lines are installed above ground to ensure that any kind of leaks or anything like that are detected instantaneously. We do have daily production staff that's visiting site daily and conducting inspections on a daily basis. And then we have third parties who are taking those inspections further with optical gas imaging surveys, so basically flare infrared cameras for further leak detection. Everything else on location is automated and can be controlled remotely. So shutdowns can occur from an operator's truck, house, or from here in the office. And long-term lighting is utilized to minimize light pollution and protect wildlife. And we do have partnerships in place with midstream providers. So all of our production streams, gas, oil, and produced water are on pipeline during the flowback period and from day one of production. So there's no volumes that are expected to be trucked at any time. Next slide, please. This is just a summary of cumulative impacts. Aaron touched on a lot of these earlier, but we have limited receptors and our closest residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, childcare facility, school, or disproportionately impacted community are all over 1 mile away or more than 2,000 feet away from the nearest public road. Our haul route utilizes nearby local highways, and we're utilizing 2.2 miles of existing access road with approximately a half mile of new road. This location was previously approved with a disturbed area of 12.5 acres, and that's been reduced to 4.6 with redesigns. And we utilize local vendors, contractors to just basically limit all of our overall impacts from truck traffic and everything like that over a broader general area. Next slide, please. So just wanted to touch on this slide and kind of look at the history of these two DSUs and this OGDP and kind of where it was originally planned several years back and where it's come today, and just kind of understand how Mallard's trying to minimize impacts. But essentially, you can see originally this overall 9 square mile development area was planned with 8 pads and 5 different DSUs. And we've reduced that to 3 pads along a single corridor and 2 DSUs. And you can see the associated metrics there. Wells have been reduced significantly. Acreage and miles of road are reduced significantly. And the associated pipelines that connect all these pads are all reduced significantly as well. And with some of the discussion earlier about pads and impacts over 1 square mile, you can see that there are alternative pads that can develop these DSUs, but on the cumulative and beneficial impacts basis, I think by aligning everything on single corridors here, it's a much smaller impact versus what you can see the original area plan was. And then just to touch on timeline of development here, not just on the Harlequin South pad, but among 3 pads, they're essentially set up to be developed sequentially along the same monthly timeline that you saw for Harlequin South pad. So essentially we'll develop each pad outside of the window, shut down operations between not shut down production, but essentially we won't have any construction going on during that winter concentration window, and then essentially start the new pad outside the window the next year. Next slide, please. So this is the director's recommendation for approval. I'll just touch on the highlighted comments here that this OGDP complies with all applicable requirements of the commission rules. The director recommends that the commission approve the Mallard Harlequin South Pad OGDP. Next slide, please. To summarize, we believe that Harlequin South OGDP is protective of public safety, welfare, public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. It's supported by Weld County, who has the local authority here, supported by CPW. We've committed to best management practices to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to the community, the environment, and other sensitive receptors. And as you've seen, we've designed the overall area plan to consolidate locations or reduce overall surface impact and minimize cumulative impacts. At this time, we'd like to open up for any questions that Aaron and I may take for any of our staff that's also on the line.
Thank you to the panel for the presentation of the OGDP. Do we have questions from commissioners? Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. Appreciate the presentation and some of the points that you highlighted. I'll admit I'm sort of rethinking this whole thing with respect to the density questions that I was asking Mr. Moret, in that, you know, I think one of the points he made, and I know is generally an important consideration for wildlife, is when there is existing development, if you can push them closer together, then you leave the undeveloped area, a greater undeveloped area available for the animals to move. And so I'm wondering, did you consider, or would it even be possible to move these pads closer together within the DSUs that you have available and still access all the minerals, just to further minimize disturbance? And I'll say that related to that, the additional stretch of road that's being developed, you know, 2,500 feet is still a half mile. Linear barriers are particularly detrimental to pronghorn for migration in general. They avoid roads sometimes. They will just, like, if a new road is built, they'll stay on one side of it. Fences are really problematic. And so I'm just thinking, if you can push those three pads closer together, then that, you know, it creates a lot more usable habitat around it. Is that a possibility?
There's some technical feasibility of pushing the pads together and, you know, extended lateral reaches in a lateral direction, and then, you know, with 2-mile wells. And then there's consultation with the landowners and where they have preferred the pads to be located based on their, you know, agriculture plans. So, you know, we kind of took all factors into consideration, and, you know, probably a lot of that is weighted on, you know, the surface owners and, you know, their plans for the land and agriculture. So I think we've put together what we think is the best plan, considering all of those factors. So, you know, technically, from a feasibility standpoint, there's some movement that can be done, but based on the ability of the laterals to reach all the subsurface minerals, it is a little bit limited.
And
Go ahead.
If I could just add a little as well, Commissioner. That was definitely part of our initial conversations with CPW. As you saw in that one slide where we kind of showed our original development plan for this area, you know, we definitely had various pads developing the DSU, but with the focus idea of kind of aligning everything in one corridor, that was a way to minimize those barriers that you spoke of. And rather than, you know, having pads come, you know, every which way throughout that development area, it was that concept of minimizing to one single corridor seemed like the most appropriate way to handle this development, and CPW seemed to be supportive of that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I did notice that, and I appreciate that. I think that, you know, the new plan is definitely much less disruptive, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate all the BMPs that you all came up with. I think, you know, if to the extent that you can reduce the distance between these pads, since they're, you know, they're all yours and they're all within the DSU, the better off it will be in terms of the disruptions to the habitat and the animals moving through it. So I'll just make that comment. The other item is just more of a comment, and that is just similar to what I mentioned to Mr. Moret, that I think the communications could be tightened up in terms of, what's presented as a waiver, rather than just some emails that sort of suggest a few things, but it's not entirely clear, and I think I had in my notes that there was something that was written in quotes. I thought it was in the summary consultation, but it didn't match what was written in the emails. So I will just again note, I think a direct, as Commissioner Messner also noted, a specific CPW waiver document, that if I don't completely have a problem with you kind of putting together language that then CPW affirms. But I think having that in a separate document is just going to make it clearer. I think it would also be useful to say that, the waiver is, or that it's the ALA is being waived due to XYZ reasons. I think that would be useful to have. And I think that, that kind of documentation is just going to make it much clearer, in looking at this going forward. So, again.
Yeah, absolutely, Commissioner. Appreciate the feedback. As we all talked about earlier, I think new regulations, everyone was working through them. We started our consultation back in April, so it's very new to everyone, but absolutely, I think that's great feedback.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to just take a second to thank the applicant for I think generally speaking, the application was thorough. The information provided was good. It was easy to read, and that's helpful for me as I'm reviewing oil and gas development plans. And so, and I know this is a newer process and maybe the first time you've gone through it. And so, but know that the majority of the information that I was looking for was certainly available within your application. So I appreciate that. And I think, so I've got probably a question and a comment. I appreciate that the application is looking to minimize surface disturbance. I think that's a good thing, particularly in high priority habitat. It gave me a little bit of heartburn because initially when I was reading emails, I saw that perhaps one of the reasons for minimizing surface disturbance was so that you didn't have to pay as much mitigation, which is perfectly allowable in the rules as written. But I think that overall, I'm supportive of trying to mitigate and minimize the surface disturbance of any operation to the greatest extent possible. And if that means that there's less surface disturbance, then that is what our rules allow as far as mitigation expenses associated with that. Now, regarding the timing of it, I certainly am hearing you say that the intent is not to have operations associated besides production, but as far as drilling operations or any kind of production, construction operations to happen during the winter concentration window. There is no firm commitment to that. And so I think an ask is, can we agree that rather than having, should you choose to develop operations in that window, that notice be provided to both COGCC and CPW so that we don't have to find out about that through some sort of enforcement or inspection after the fact, but rather it's a I imagine for you guys, it'll be a contemplated and known action if it just happens that you're going to have to shift a rig within those windows that were provided notice so that we could do those calculations and be able to collect the additional mitigation necessary for that in kind of the contemplated timelines associated with, I think, what the intent of the mitigation rule is. So thoughts on that from the applicant, if you're so inclined.
Yeah, I thank you for the question and the comment. Yeah, I don't see any problem with the, COA or whatever's necessary of a notification. And, just for some clarification, the scale of an operator size of Mallard, we don't have a rig running 365 days a year. essentially we share rigs with operators of equivalent size. So, that timeline that's laid out, essentially we have flow back that ends in October, and that gives us a 2-month window for flexibility in there. But because we share rigs with other similar scale operators and frac crews and things like that, a delay of a rig coming from another operator or frac crew or things like that, can cascade into weeks and possible months. So there is, I think that's ultimately why we did come to that agreement with CPW, is that our intent is to stay outside of that window, but I just want you to understand that it's easy to see where a few cascading delays that aren't even from the Mallard side, but from, previous operators who are sharing equipment can cascade where it would push us into that. And I think it's more beneficial, instead of to shut off at, New Year's Eve with an incomplete construction site, take the necessary days or weeks to finish up and reduce those impacts. But yeah, I don't see any problem with, an official notice should we have that situation occur.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the response. I do understand the challenges of scheduling the different operations. And so I think just that notice provision would certainly, I think, be good in this application. So I appreciate that.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation today. I agree with the comments from the other commissioners that it was a good application, and I am going to apologize now because I may have read things a little too quickly, and and normally I try to send my questions ahead of time, and this is a similar question I sent to the other applicant. I think when I read electrification, that I was under the impression that you would be using electrification for drilling, and that's not the case. It's just for running the facilities when you're done. Can you describe for me, for drilling, are you using diesel engines or natural gas then, since you're not using electric?
Thank you for the question. So we have capabilities for both. So essentially at the time that these wells are drilled, we have dual fuel capability. So we've got the ability to use diesel or natural gas based on, the best available technology and kind of consensus on research on what's best for emissions, which I think natural gas, has been concluded to combust quite a bit cleaner.
Right. So I guess my suggestion is a preference for the natural gas, because I think this site is still in the non-attainment area for ozone attainment, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm a day late and $1 short. That's my bad. But thank you for sharing the information.
Commissioner Najapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just also wanted to say as well that I thought this was a really overall a well done application, and that the information was thorough. I also appreciated in your cumulative impacts plan that you are intending to replug 2 older wells that just to ensure that they're plugged properly. I was curious. I don't believe that they were specified. Are they somewhere close to the actual area? Have you identified the specific wells, and could you say a little bit more about that?
I believe those are just 2 wells that are under typical wellbore remediation. So it's just revisiting any old vertical wells that are in the area before horizontal completions commence, and making sure that they have adequate cement and casing coverage over the aquifers. I believe that's what those 2 wells are, but Aaron, I'm not sure if that's what those 2 specifically are discussing. That's the only thing that I can imagine we would be plugging out here.
Correct. That would be a commitment to, looking into and reworking any old wells that need to be brought up to today's safety standards, in relation to prior to us developing our wells.
Okay, thank you. So these are wells that were previously plugged, but are also kind of in that same DSU. So potentially could be communicating. Is that a part of the concern?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, every application essentially has a review of all vertical and existing horizontal, whether producing or plugged, to make sure that they have adequate protections over aquifers and productive zones. And so any remediation that's necessary is conducted on previously plugged and active wells for any upcoming horizontal drilling.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So then the intent is to plug at least, you're sort of committing to plugging at least 2, but there could be more. Do I understand that correctly?
If there were 2 listed, then that's what's been identified under the wellbore remediation plan, which is part of the permitting process.
Okay.
I just don't have the specific recollection in my memory, but that must be what that is.
Okay, thank you very much.
Further questions for the panel? Okay, I'm not seeing any further questions. Thank you for the presentation. I believe we are now at the space which is Commissioner deliberations, since we've done the questions part. My 2 cents is the application is well done. Appreciate Commissioner Nanjapa's probing around getting wells even closer than you're already doing it. And I appreciate the answer from the applicant that you've moved from 8 pads to 3 pads. You've got it kind of in a corridor, and recognize that there are landowner and ag issues, as well as the need to develop the mineral estate. So I think this is well done. Appreciate Commissioner Messner's request and your consent to a notice provision, whether that's a BMP that you work out with staff or a COA. I really don't care. I'm in favor of the application. Those are my deliberative thoughts. Others with deliberative thoughts? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with your sentiment there. And we'll make a motion for approval here. I would include in my motion a BMP, because I believe there's been operator consent on that, because that's cleaner than a condition of approval around notice associated with any anticipated activity to be included in the winter concentration timing window, as indicated by Colorado Parks and Wildlife's consultation. So with that, I'll make a motion to approve docket number 210700111 with the inclusion of the BMP that I previously indicated.
Do we have a second? Commissioner Gonzalez?
Yeah, I'll second that motion, Chair, and I'll add my comments. You know, this is in my mind, this is a well thought out, well organized, well laid out OGDP. Not just plan in general, but really application associated with it. I found the coordination and the information to be easy to put together, and I appreciated that. I thought the presentation by the applicant was thorough. Really set me in the right spot to really kind of corner out my already pretty I guess thorough understanding of this project. This project has the support of the staff, of CPW, and of Weld County through the WOGLA, as well as the surface owner. Those are all super impactful for me. I appreciate the consolidation to the extent that it was to the 3 pads in the linear fashion that really is a super efficient way of laying out those pads. And so I appreciate that. Applications well within the rules. And I am very comfortable moving forward with this project, and that supports my second to Commissioner Messner's motion.
Very good. We have a motion and a second. Is there further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much for the presentation. At this point, I think it would be appropriate to take a short morning break. Let's return at 10:50. That gives 10 minutes for everybody, and then we'll take up our next application. Turn the recording back on. Very good. Let's wait for Commissioner McGowan to be here. There she is. And Ms. Jost, I believe we are now taking up docket 2109-00150, Crestone Peak Resources, Blue 365333231 Oil and Gas Development Plan. What a name.
Yes, thank you, Chair Robbins. And if I may, Ms. Larson, can you please promote Kathy Stearman to panelist as well? There we go. Great. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Well, good morning, commissioners, chair, Director Murphy, COGCC staff, as well as members of the public. My name is Jamie Jost, and I, along with my partner, Kelsey Wazelinski, represent Crestone Peak Resources Operating LLC on the Blue OGDP up for hearing today. Thank you for reading off the lengthy docket number in this, Chair Robbins. We appreciate it. I will skip that at this point. Thank you for the opportunity to present this OGDP to you this morning, and we look forward to our discussion. I'm going to go ahead and screen share, if I may. And can everyone see my screen?
We can see it. You're still not in like screen sharing mode, but if that's your preference.
Yes, let's see here. And how does that look?
That looks great.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Well, Crestone will cover several topics today, as we did in our last OGDP. And there will be three main presenters. We've got Dan Harrington, Nathan Bennett, and Kathy Stearman will be providing the presentation today. And we also have a number of subject matter experts on hand if we have any questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Dan Harrington.
Morning, Commissioners. My name is Dan Harrington, and I am the S Development Lead for this part of Civitas's position. I wanted to start today by providing a general overview of the Blue location. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. It's a new location located in the city of Aurora, just north of I-70, sited on land actually owned by Civitas. These wells will drill east to west from the pad and will complete development of a 1920-acre DSU. We do have an approved permit from the city of Aurora, and the Blue location is not within 2,000 feet of any RBU. It is not in high priority habitat. It is not in a disproportionately impacted community. The Blue location also did not meet the criteria to conduct an alternative location analysis and did not receive any public comment. Before I move on to this slide, I wanted to address one commissioner question that we received. Is Crestone planning any offsets for the development of the Crestone Blue site? And the answer to that is yes. There are offset developments from the Blue site, both to the north and the south, with pad sites in sections 28 and in section 2. However, the offsetting locations are not appropriately sited to reach the entirety of the Blue OGDP, and both sites associated development areas will require the entire well count we're allowed at each site. So essentially, we're developing here by rows. The DSU directly to the east of the Blue has already been developed, as you can see in the map. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is to address another question we had, the relationship of the Blue OGDP to the box elder cap. This came up during our last hearing. Given the anticipated timeframes associated with approval of the box elder cap, Crestone made the strategic decision in early 2021 to proceed with 2 Aurora OGDPs. Those are the Lone Tree, which was seen 2 weeks ago, and the Blue, which you're seeing today. We moved these ahead in advance of the box elder cap to avoid delaying our entire city of Aurora asset permitting to the completion of the cap. However, it's important to note that the Blue site's oil and gas locations cumulative impacts have been reflected in the box elder cap CI statement, and the siting is accurately reflected in the cap. Thank you, Jamie. By way of a brief timeline, Crestone submitted the blue OGDP on September 14th, 2021. We received approval of the local government permit on October 13th, 2021. And this site is in line with our committed Aurora operator agreement siting. We received our completeness determination in November 2021, mailed the required notices in December, and received no objections to the application. The blue was originally sited in June 2019 within the City of Aurora operator agreement, which includes a specific location. And on October 13th, as we stated, the City of Aurora approved the blue site permit. Upon review of all information provided on the blue OGDP on February 16th, the director entered her recommendation for approval of this OGDP application. Specifically, the director recommendation provided that the proposed location does not meet any of the criteria listed in 304B2. This is, an ALA was not required and none was submitted. Staff identified no significant concerns regarding the siting of the OGDP or the proposed location. Staff concludes there are no significant potential direct adverse impacts to public health, safety, and welfare. Based on this information, staff concludes the risk of contamination from this location to groundwater will be minimized by the successful implementation of the proposed BMPs. And staff concludes there are no significant potential direct adverse impacts to wildlife resources. Crestone will comply with all applicable 1200 series rules regarding the protection of wildlife resources. We believe these are important points for the commissioners to consider today. Crestone anticipates starting construction of this site in the fourth quarter of 2022, with drilling and completions in the first, second, and third quarters of 2023, with production starting in the third quarter of 2023. Upon approval of this OGDP, Crestone will be filing the corresponding Form 2s in order to keep this process moving forward. With that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Nathan Bennett.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Nathan Bennett, and I am the manager of well and location permitting with Civitas. I'm going to take a few minutes today to discuss a few of the best management practices we will be utilizing on the blue location. The City of Aurora operator agreement requires almost 50 BMPs to be utilized on all locations within its jurisdiction. A few of the BMPs that will be employed at the blue location include baseline sound studies and mitigation, low profile tanks, fugitive dust suppression, ambient air sampling, landscaping, and traffic management plans. We did receive a few commissioner questions surrounding electrification of our rig. These questions were, what does electrification if possible / available mean? What percentage chance is there that the operator will be using electric rigs? And if not electric rigs, can the operator clarify it will not be using diesel powered engines to drill at the site? Since this is in the ozone non-attainment area, I suspect a BMP would be to try to avoid diesel powered engines. It is Crestone's preference to drill on utility power. However, at this early stage, we cannot fully commit to using an electric drilling rig due to sourcing and infrastructure needs. Coordination with Xcel Energy is ongoing, and we are working together to determine what is needed to deliver utility power to the location. With respect to emissions in the ozone non-attainment area, it is Civitas' expectation that our drilling partners maintain their own ESG programs, which will center around emissions mitigation. Crestone will continue to commit to mitigating emissions through operational efficiencies and by working with experienced partners. As previously stated, Crestone will continue the effort to secure utility power. I'd be remiss if I did not mention that Crestone's drilling time is tracking toward a 20% reduction in drilling days per well relative to our 2019 drilling program. This timing in and of itself reduces emissions from drilling as a whole and is something the Civitas team is proud of. In order to address questions on oil pipeline usage, I can confirm that Crestone is working diligently to ensure oil pipeline is available for the blue oil and gas location. As of today, Crestone cannot commit to utilizing oil pipeline on the date of first production at this location. However, it is Crestone's intent to utilize oil pipeline infrastructure for the development of blue as soon as possible. Once constructed and placed into service, 100% of the liquid hydrocarbons produced at the Blue Oil and Gas location will be transported via pipeline. The City of Aurora mandates the use of pipelines except when factors may prevent or delay the installation of oil pipeline. In those instances where pipeline is delayed, Crestone will utilize industry-recognized alternatives to transport oil until pipeline infrastructure is viable, as is expressly allowed under the City of Aurora Operator Agreement. The practice of trucking liquid hydrocarbons is an industry-recognized alternative to pipeline and may be utilized until such a time as pipeline infrastructure is available. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Kathy Stearman.
Thanks, Nathan. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Kathy Stearman, and I am the manager of air compliance and engineering for Civitas. The Blue facility will be constructed and operated to minimize air emissions. Colorado Reg 7 requires air monitoring, and Crestone has strengthened our monitoring program through commitments in the Aurora Operator Agreement and the field-wide air quality plan for the Watkins area. Baseline and continuous monitoring will be performed at least 10 days before pad construction. This will include monitoring for VOCs, monitoring for methane, and that program will be supplemented by SUMA canister data. Real-time VOC and methane monitoring will continue for the life of the facility at monitoring stations that surround the pad. Crestone will report our monitoring data to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment on a monthly basis during pre-production and early production. The Blue monitoring program will be installed and the data will be generated by third-party consultants, which ensures independence. And Crestone will always continue to cooperate with the agency's own monitoring programs and also unannounced facility inspections, which are fairly routine operations in Colorado. Crestone will perform leak detection every month using optical gas imaging for at least the first year. I'll hand the presentation back to Dan.
Dan, I believe you're on mute.
I apologize for that. Crestone is seeking a 1920 acre drilling and spacing unit in conjunction with this OGDP application as shown on the map. So we wanted to touch on a few of the items in support of that request. From a land standpoint, Crestone holds 64% leasehold interest in the DSU. The minerals are a combination of fee and federal, and the surface is owned in fee, and Crestone holds an existing SUA with the surface owner, which is ourselves. Crestone is committed to finalizing a communitization agreement with the BLM for development of the federal mineral acreage in the application lands prior to the commencement of drilling operations. From a geologic standpoint, we're only intending to develop the Niobrara here. The Niobrara formation is 320 foot thick, common source of supply, and is continuous under the OGDP lands. There is no Codell here. On the engineering side, we're planning 7 wells in the DSU, and they will be 3-mile laterals. There is one existing PDP, the Blue 1H well, which you can see on the map. That well was drilled under a 1280 spacing unit by ConocoPhillips, and we are infilling and, as you can see, fanning out in the 3rd mile to efficiently develop that 3rd section. The engineering testimony illustrates an estimated drainage area of 171 acres per well with a half length of 170 feet, which is less than the requested 330 foot setbacks in the OGDP application. To summarize the presentation today, Crestone's requested release. Crestone believes that the Blue oil and gas location is the most protective location for the public health, safety, welfare, environment, and wildlife resources. And the Form 2A includes voluminous BMPs crafted to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts. The Blue OGDP has the support of the City of Aurora via the approved local government permit, and the support of Director Murphy is set forth in her recommendation for approval. Crestone respectfully requests approval from this commission on the Blue OGDP. Civitas, Crestone, and Jost Energy Law would like to thank this commission, the COGCC director and staff, and Mr. Jeffrey Moore and his staff on the City of Aurora side for their hard work on this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harrington. Thank you to yourself and the panel for the presentation of the proposed OGDP. Do we have questions? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation today. I think some of those questions were mine that got submitted ahead of time, and I appreciate you. I appreciate you responding, but I'm still not sure that I have clarity about the answers. So this is me as a commissioner. I appreciate when you say you're going to try to do something, but then it leaves it fuzzy to me as to the actual commitment if the thing that you're trying to do doesn't come to fruition. So in this case, we'll try to use electrification if we can for drilling is awesome, and I appreciate that. I still don't feel I have clarity around if electrification doesn't work, are we using diesel engines or are we using natural gas? And so if I could just have an answer of which one you think you're going to use, which one you will be using would be very much appreciated.
Certainly,
Dan,
and go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, no, I think I have a little bit of help history with this. I do understand that our current setup is diesel. We appreciate your questions about ozone non-attainment. We agree that the state definitely needs to stay on the path of attainment for ozone. When we look at emissions, we have to look at our direct emissions, our on-site emissions, but we also look very carefully at our indirect emissions, which are scope 2 emissions. And all of the fuel blends have kind of different impacts, but to stay on the ozone attainment path, we really have to look at this from a regional perspective. That said, we do wish to achieve line power, but diesel is our backup. I think the other thing that we don't want, we are investigating fuel blends on drilling, but we don't want temperamental power, and it continues to be very important to drill efficiently and to make that process really what it's intended to be, which is a short duration process. So Nate, didn't want to cut you off there. So
Commissioner, if Kathy's response answered your question, I have nothing further to add. If you would like further clarity on the electrification, please indicate so.
Thank you for your response. So am I understanding, Ms. Dearman, are you saying that if you were to use natural gas, you would be drilling for a longer period of time because of the fuel mixture and the time and the power fluctuations?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that needs to be investigated. I think that the shorter duration of drilling, just due to industry practices over the last couple of years, really is significant, because if you're drilling a well for 10 days and then nowadays we're drilling it in 8 days, you're reducing 20%. So I did not mean to imply that diesel versus line power is going to affect your ability to drill on a certain time frame. But I think it is important to still look at it from a lens of, when you look at different fuel blends, they have different impacts, whether you're looking at greenhouse gas emissions and your carbon intensity, or your direct emissions is VOCs on site. So they all have different impacts.
Okay, so I guess I'm feeling a little frustrated where if I'm trying to decide if something is substantially equivalent, and there's kind of language that is not clear about what option will be chosen. It's hard for me as a commissioner to figure out substantial equivalency and cumulative impacts and what the impact of this site would be. And so in the future, for me, I just want clarity around what you can achieve, not what you will try to achieve. Kind of like Yoda, do not try, do, right? Because it's hard then to figure out the pros and the cons, the pluses and the minuses, and how these pieces all fit together. So that for me personally would be a little more helpful to just have clarity about what you can do. And if you want to add, this is what we can do, this is what we're going to try to do, that's fine too. And maybe it's just a rearranging of how things will be done would be helpful for me. So in relation to the cumulative impacts, I think this feels similar to me to the other application, which is a part of Box Elder, and the cumulative impacts will be shown when we come to you with our cap. And so again, it's kind of hard to discern incrementally what this particular project means, because it is part of another project that my understanding is upcoming. And so for other projects, I specifically had been asking, what will you be doing if your cumulative impact is a positive this, then what are you doing to mitigate over here, so that hopefully we try to get to a reduction in whatever our impact is. In particular, the messaging from industry, I think, which is we can continue to drill and you will see a reduction in air emissions and other things that we're worried about as far as impacts. And so again, for me as a commissioner, it's hard for me to determine the incremental cumulative impact of this project, because it is and will be a part of a larger project. So just some feedback from me and what I'm struggling with on it when I read this application, similar to the last one that came through related to the box elder, and just kind of what I'm struggling with.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the questions, Commissioner McGowan. Just a note that when I read applications, if it says I'll try, to me, that just means it won't happen. That's how I read it, right? I'm not saying that they won't try, right? But unless there's a commitment there when I'm reading an application, it's a no. Not a no on the application, but just that it can't be a certainty, right? And so that's just how I would read it, how I read it. I think generally speaking, this is a good application, and I appreciate the work that's put into this. I'll share Commissioner McGowan's comments, I think, around, some of the things that I think are challenging with this application can be resolved if it was incorporated in the cap, right? Whether that's, oil takeaway lines or, some of the associated infrastructure necessary to minimize emissions. I understand probably operationally why this one is coming separately. So, and certainly you have the ability to do that within the rules. But I think that's why caps are such a great tool that can be utilized. I just have one comment, and this is just a comment as I review things, a little pet peeve of mine, is I appreciate that we see a theme where the director's recommendation is being used in presentations, but I read the director's recommendation. That's a different consultation piece, separate from the operator's burden of proof to show that they meet the standards associated with our rules. And so I don't need to see that in the presentation personally, what the director's recommendation said, because I know what that says. And that's just as I'm reviewing things. But again, overall, I think the application meets our standards. And I appreciate that it ties into the operator agreement with the local government, and it has local government approval. And so I'll be voting in support of this.
Other questions from commission to the panel? All right, seeing no further questions, thank you to the panel for the presentation. For the application, we now will turn to deliberations by commissioners on the blue OGDP. I'm happy to go first again, but I went first last time, so I was going to allow someone else. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I don't have much to deliberate on this. I'm in support of this application of this OGDP. I will move for its approval.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the application. Is there further discussion? Commissioner Najapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No discussion in terms of concerns, but I do want to just acknowledge the concerns raised by Commissioner McGowan and the attempts to address some of these issues related to air emissions or cumulative impacts or those kinds of things. I do think that's an important thing to be very clear and specific about going forward. And so I appreciate those comments from Commissioner McGowan and supported by Commissioner Messner as well. I also agree that this is a well done proposal. Ideally, I think these OGDPs that are part of a cap, it just is a lot in terms of the intent of the cap and evaluating all these different impacts together. That for me, it would be helpful if they all came in, following the approval of the cap. But I understand, as noted, that is not a requirement. You're within the rules to do it this way. But I also feel that the application has been well done otherwise and can support it.
Commissioner McGowan.
I'm good, thanks.
Very good. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, I believe we have concluded our docket for today. Would look around the panel, the room, the commission to see if anybody has anything left. Seeing none, looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.